Have you ever had to wait in line for service? If you have, then you've experienced the problem of service supply and demand. Services cannot be inventoried, which is why managing supply and demand of service can be so problematic for service delivery. The underlying issue is lack of inventory capability, as I mentioned. There's capacity constraints, there's demand patterns. Capacity constraints could be the number of people you have, and it's unpredictable. Uh, Maybe you try some forecasting and some mathematical modeling of what demand will be, but you'll never get it exactly right. Um, so you have to think about how you can best balance your capacity utilization by pricing, market segmentation, financial return. There's a lot of factors to balance to figure out what is the optimal capacity you should have based upon the demand you'll experience and how to best price your service in order to have an optimal balance of supply and demand. Also, we'll talk about waiting and how to be more strategic when customers are forced to wait to take service delivery, which happens a lot. Here's an example of a curve that shows what happens when demand exceeds capacity or when capacity exceeds demand. And there will be peaks and valleys in service requirements from customers. And time cycle 1, time cycle 2, you can see some services are likely to be seasonal, for example. I mentioned in last chapter about lawn care service. It's going to be more active in the summertime than the wintertime, but then maybe there are other services that could be offered during the winter to try and balance your capacity with the demand. So in excess demand, your demand exceeds your maximum capacity. This means you're going to have to turn away some service, or if you try not to turn them away, you may have some unsatisfied customers because quality is going to be a problem. This is what happens when demand exceeds optimum capacity. When they're balanced, it's the ideal level. You don't have anyone overworked, customers are happy, you're doing a good job. If you have excess capacity, you're underutilizing your resources. And when you underutilize resources, that's cost, and you don't have revenue to balance against that cost. But you may have customers with high quality service. Customer wins, but you may lose because it's not going to be profitable. Some industries have this problem of wide gaps or wide swings between supply and demand. Some have it worse than others. For example, peak demand can usually be met without a major delay, or peak demand regularly exceeds capacity. For example, April 15th, March, February, March, April, you have a lot of accounting and tax prep coming. So you have peak demand regularly exceeding capacity. But you could have wide fluctuations like you do in the case of accounting and tax prep, or narrow fluctuations. It depends on the industry. For example, insurance, legal services, banking, there's usually narrow fluctuations between supply and demand. What are your constraints? Time, labor, equipment, facilities. How much time do you have in a day? How many people do you have? Do you have more than one facility or not? And then also your ability to predict what's going to happen in the future. And now, in the experience I've had with forecasting, I find that your predictions are better the degree to which you use quantitative modeling. That what happens in the future can be modeled by past events when you include cycles and take out outliers. I've seen that work better than sales forecasting. But it never works perfectly, and there's always going to be some degree of mismatch. Different services are affected differently by the categories of constraints. For example, labor, law firm, accounting firm, consulting firm, but facilities would be hotels, restaurants, hospitals, airlines. You only have so much facility capacity. So what do you do? What if demand exceeds capacity? There's different strategies you can take. If demand is too high, you try to shift the demand, reduce demand during peak times. This is why I don't know that it exists today, but going back 5 or 10 years ago, many wireless companies would offer special packages that if you called after, like any calls after 7 o'clock at night were free, for example, between 7 o'clock at night and 6 a.m. the next morning. The reason is you had all of this capacity that was going unused. But of course, if you were talking during peak demands, they're going to charge you for that because you're coming up against capacity constraints during the peak times. The same with hotels and airlines. When demand is really high, what do? You try to encourage people to either fly or stay at hotels in off-peak times, so you offer a better price. Okay, if demand is too low, you may vary the service offering. You may differentiate on price. So demand shifting is one of the number one strategies you could use to try and balance supply and demand, because you can't save inventory of service. So you're going to have to do demand shifting. Now you could also adjust capacity. You could stretch people, facilities, and equipment, maybe use part-time employees, cross-train employees, outsource activities. For example, we had a storm blow through here a couple weeks ago, and it knocked out my internet service. I could not get resolution on this for a week. And even so, the people who showed up were contractors. Comcast was outsourcing repair to a contract firm who came and had to put new cable in because lightning had taken it out. Okay, so what you have to think in terms of is something called yield management. That's the allocating the right type of capacity to the right type of customer at the right price to maximize revenue or yield. So yield is your actual revenue divided by your potential revenue. So what you're attempting to do is make the most money you can and demand shift at the same time. For example, a 200-room hotel hotel with 200 rooms. The max room rate is $100 a night. Your potential revenue is then $20,000 if you rented all 200 rooms at $100 a night. That's likely never going to happen just like this. So what you may do to try and make sure all your rooms are sold is discount them to $50 a night. So your yield becomes 50%. You've sold 200 rooms at $50. That's $10,000. So that's a 50% yield. You could charge full rate, but only 80 rooms are sold, and you could figure this out by past history. In this case, you have a 40% yield. 80 times 100 divided by 20,000. Or you could charge the full rate for 80 rooms and then discount for the remaining 120 rooms. Okay, this is why you have websites like Travelocity or Priceline.com. These are hotels that have extra capacity. They've already sold rooms at full prices and they have some left over, and they're trying to improve that yield curve. See what happens. 80 times 100 plus 120 times 50 divided by 20,000. Now you have a 70% yield. So you've improved your yield with demand shifting by charging some at full rate and some discounting. The problem with this then is potentially overbooking. That happens in airlines a lot. Customer alienation. If you paid full price and you know, like in an airline, you paid full price for a ticket and you know who's sitting next to you didn't, that's not going to make you very happy. So that could be a problem. The customer may suffer in a yield management system. Another way to look at balancing supply and demand is through waiting lines, which always seems to happen. And my stories always involve Comcast because it's a service probably I use the most for internet. But I had to replace a modem that was taken out by lightning. And I walked in and I saw that there were 17 people ahead of me, and it was really depressing. I'm thinking I really don't have the time to wait this long for service, but I didn't have any choice. If I didn't do that, I would have to call in an appointment and wait a couple of days. Here's some different ways to organize queuing in the waiting line. A single queue, multiple queues, or take a number. Okay, in the Comcast I went to, you took a number. Turned out I was number 17, but they had multiple service stations, and it didn't take too long. But I often see airlines with a single queue looking something like this, or they may have multiple queues separating regular, economy class versus business class. Some strategies is have a reservation process. Maybe if you call ahead for a reservation, you can avoid waiting in line. Maybe you pay a premium price to go to the head of the line. Or if everyone's going to wait, give them something to do. For example, when I go get a haircut, I typically have to wait. But while I'm waiting, I may pull out my phone and read the news, check email. But what the company has done at the haircutting location is to provide magazines to read, to try and make your waiting more pleasurable to the extent they can. Some things to think about. Unoccupied time feels longer than occupied time. Pre-process waits feel longer than in-process waits. Okay, anxiety waits makes wait seem longer. Let me go back to this pre-process waits feel longer than in-process. For example, when I get on a plane to travel somewhere, all the stuff you have to go through, clearing security and finally getting on the plane and they're loading the luggage, that feels like a long time. But when we finally take off, I can relax. I know the flight's actually going to leave. It's fairly close to on time, and I can gauge when I'm going to arrive. But until I actually take off, I always have that uncertainty whether we're actually going to leave. You never know. And so that's a pre-process wait, and it seems longer, and it causes anxiety. Uncertainty seems longer than finite waits. Unexplained waits seem longer than explained waits. Unfair waits feel longer than equitable waits. The more valuable the service, the longer the customer will wait. So when I went into the Comcast waiting room, and it was number 17, you see all kind of products you can look at. There's multiple TVs with different shows going on the wall. And there's also a lot of tablets where you could check internet, play games if you wanted to, and it was a way to keep you occupied as well as helping to sell some of their products. So, as we've seen in Module 6, delivering is very important. You have to think about how you're going to do that in order to meet your commitments. The customer plays a central role in the delivery of service, maybe almost could be considered a partial employee. And finally, supply and demand are an ongoing issue with delivering service. It's something you cannot fully escape from because of the fact that you cannot inventory services. So you have to look at various techniques of demand shifting or helping the customer through the process of waiting. So that's the briefings for this module. We'll see you in the discussion threads for Module 6.